Hello, I'm your host, James Mackey. Welcome to the Hiring Success Show. I'm really excited about today's episode. We have a good friend of mine on the show, Boris Epstein. Boris, thanks for joining me today.
How you doing, James? Good to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, for sure. I'm really excited for the topics that we outlined in our prep call. We got a lot of good stuff that's going to be very valuable and help guide talent strategy for folks. Before we jump into the topics, would you mind providing a brief introduction?
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Boris Epstein. I've been in the recruiting and talent game for a long time. I started a company called Binc um, 21 years ago in 2002, and ran it uh, very successfully up until 2021, which point we got acquired by Robinhood, and I joined Robinhood. Spent my first year there in recruiting M&A, so working really closely with corp dev in acquiring companies, and then spent my last year there as head of talent acquisition. And I just moved on from Robinhood, so I'm in the very early days of figuring out what's next. For the audience, Binc was a tech-focused recruiting agency. We pioneered what the market now considers boutique tech RPO. So we developed an innovative way to work on the inside of growing technology companies to help them meet their hiring goals within a compressed time period. We started doing that in the 09-10 time frame, and kind of ran that whole growth cycle that we just experienced this past decade. So we were on the on the inside of the very early days at Pinterest and Airbnb and Ripple, and in our later days, I spent more time at the high growth companies of Square, Stripe. Robinhood was a great client of ours, and so on and so forth. It was a great time. And we have a lot of great recruiting alumni out in the community, still representing those practices and values.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you have a great reputation in the tech space. Most folks in talent and technology that have been around and are well connected have heard of you, and I've really enjoyed speaking with you over the past. I think it's been at least a year, maybe even 2 years now. I don't know how long have we known each other at this point.
I'd
It's
say at
flying.
least a year.
At least a
Time
year.
flies and is
Yeah,
equal as nebulous
I
these
don't know.
days.
Yeah, 5 years, 1 year. I don't know anymore. I really just don't anymore. It's all a blur. But anyways, yeah, I'm really excited, and I think one of the things we discussed is at when during your time building Binc, a big part of what you did when you went inside companies was, of course, your team was providing support with the hands-on recruiting, but as we all know, right, or most of us know, it's not enough to have great recruiters. Like, you need to have a talent first culture, and you have to have certain pieces in place to put together an attractive offering for candidates to convert them into employees. And you have to have an attractive offering for employees as well to ensure that they stay and they're happy and whatnot, and
Yep.
could kind of fulfill that like life cycle, if you will. So um, I'm kind of curious to get your thoughts. Like, let's say you're going into a high growth stage company. They have a big funding round, or there's some type of growth event where they have decided that they need to hire. What, like, when you're going into that environment, of course there's the horsepower aspect of recruiting, but what else are you doing from those early stages in that partnership to actually ensure that they can hire successfully, right, beyond the horsepower piece, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question, because a lot of what like our team would bring to the equation is the horsepower to to amplify whatever it is that might already be working, but at a considerably smaller scale. Um, one of the first things that we look for, because any client that we take on, we have to believe that we could achieve hiring success for them. Of course, recruiting can only achieve one part of hiring success, because ultimately no candidates ever choose to join the recruiter they're working with. The candidates always only choose to join the company that's being represented. So the company has to be kind of like like be like worthy of the recruiting effort, so to say, and be able to ultimately attract and retain that talent. So the things that we would look for, first and foremost, is the story. So we'd like to connect with someone as close to the founder as possible, and hear their story of where did they come from before the company even existed? What was the impetus for the company getting started? What was the early success story? How did it get to where it is today? What's going on in the world that this company is solving that's compelling? What unique approach is the company taking that's differentiating from its respective competition? What's its respective talent philosophy? Who all is involved in fulfilling on this mission with this company? Who are the investors? Who's on the team? Who's on the leadership team? What's like the talent ethos? And then what's their talent aspirations? Who do they want to attract? Why should those people be attracted to this respective opportunity? What does the process look like? And what's the ultimate compelling reason that those individuals should ultimately choose to join, above and beyond the many other great options that exist in our ecosystem? So we look for something unique and distinguished and high value in that value proposition that we then, as the recruiting arm, believe we could amplify to a broader set of the market. Usually when a company that's in high growth, what they usually need help with is the amplification part. But if you amplify a mediocre value proposition, you're going to get mediocre talent. If there's something really unique and distinctive there, and you amplify that, that's really where kind of the magic happens. So we did a pretty good job of being able to identify these companies and the identifying of like Pinterest before anyone knew what a virtual pin board was, for example, or other companies of that sort that were on the kind of earlier side of what later became an obvious place to be.
Sure. And I think too, there must have been situations in which like companies needed help uncovering really what their employee or candidate value proposition was, right? I mean, like, I think that that must have been the case. So like, did you also kind of work with the companies on fine tuning that messaging, or they might have thought like, hey, this is a good value proposition, but in reality, given the fact that you have experience working with several growth stage tech companies, like, well, everybody says that. We actually have to dial into this part of the mission or this part of the reason why the company was started. I'm just wondering, like, how much work did you do kind of fine tuning that message, and what did that process look like? If you did.
That's a good question. That's a good question. I wish there was like a really neat little framework that can be followed for listeners of the podcast to be able to follow. It really does take acute listening to founders, to other employees of the company, and really simply asking the question, like, why are you here? Why are you compelled to be here versus the many other places that you could possibly be? If you ask, like, a lot of people are hiring engineers, for example. If you ask 10 incredibly talented engineers at any given company why they're there versus whatever other options they likely have to go work for, you're going to get something unique and distinctive about that, about what's attractive at that company. So that's one very important data point. The other important data point is from the candidates. So when you go out to candidates, you might think you have a compelling value proposition, but you're not going to know if it's compelling until the person who you aspire to get chooses to accept an offer with you and join your company. So when that person does choose to accept your offer, you want to ask them why they accepted it, and that may seem either obvious or not obvious, but getting your finger on the pulse of why people are ultimately joining and why people are responding to you is a second major data point. So once you have those two data points, you could then kind of curate your follow-on messaging to basically like hit at that essence. And I've been involved in a lot of different experiences where you start thinking one thing's the value prop, but it turns out to be something completely different. Or you start with knowing that it's a mediocre value prop, and then through that process you learn that you can you ultimately land on whatever ends up being the thing that works.
Yeah, it's I think too, when it comes to value proposition, like sometimes I think companies feel like they need to have this incredible product that's going to change the world, or something to that effect, which is really actually not necessary. I mean, some folks might be really buy into that mission, but the reality is that just having, focusing on like fundamental things that people care about, like when it comes to a healthy culture, a good kind of work-life balance, great professional development opportunities where, uh, you know, leaders and the company culture is helping them invest in their own professional development. And they're actually, I recorded a show earlier today, a podcast earlier today with Sandy Gold, who's a chief people officer. He ran people for companies like Verizon Media. He was there for like when when that new company was like formated, and then he was
Yeah.
at uh, Yahoo and did the turnaround there, and a lot of like big organizations. And so, he was kind of talking about how like one of the first things that they would do to turn around to attract great people is they would focus on the concept of like internal hiring, right? Like moving people, reskilling folks, and giving opportunities for great people to move within the company. And it's things like that where it's like you can create this compelling culture for people that are coming into the organization, and really just kind of embracing that like people first, talent first culture. Right. And I mean, it's like
Yeah.
for me, for our companies, Binc, and I'm assuming you probably had a similar experience, but at Secure Vision, we do essentially very similar, at least to what Binc did in terms of embedded recruiting for the tech industry. It's recruiting services. Like that's what we
Right.
do. And so like from a mission standpoint, really dialing into the people first capacity models to ensure folks aren't overworked, good benefits, work-life balance, diversity, those types of items were really what we dialed into to create an environment where folks really, really wanted to work. And that became our value proposition. And you could, and what's interesting is you would think like, well, anybody can replicate that. Are we really building something that's really different? The reality is like, yeah, people would come to us because a lot of other recruiting agencies were not putting an emphasis on their experience. And so we
Right.
were able to attract some really amazing people as a result of that strategy.
Yeah, and so it sounds like you're dialed in to what your current team and aspiring team values, and that's ultimately what it's about. I think companies want to be authentic to themselves because there's something authentic about every founder, every company, every team. So you want to be authentic to that, and you want to be able to express whatever that authenticity respectively is to your current team so that they know why they're there and should stay. And then you want to be able to express that to your, aspiring team so that they know why they should join you versus, whoever other might sound like a competitor. That's a good point you bring up about the internal mobility component. At the last LinkedIn conference, career mobility and internal mobility headlined that whole show. And it probably spoke to the times that we're a part of, right? Like companies are getting a little bit leaner, a little lighter on the hiring output, and retention of key people is critical, and great internal mobility programs is critical to the continued retention of great people. So smart move. That sounds like Sandy kind of played at some of those places you that.
Yeah, it's definitely a really good episode to check out. Very, very smart guy. And I think this is a good segue just to building culture around hiring and people. I think, making hiring a competitive advantage often requires a cultural shift to a talent first organization. Really trying to get the mindset of like, in business, we essentially have two customers. We have the customers of revenue that provide revenue, but we also sort of have to look at employees as customers, and we have to create a compelling employee journey and experience there in order to attract and retain the best folks. So um, I'm curious to get your thoughts on like what a talent first organization, a hiring first organization means to you. Like, how do you like in those good environments, how do you see leaders collaborate together? How does everybody kind of work together to achieve, great hiring outcomes?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. I think when you look at organizations, there are organizations that say they are something first, and it could be product first, it could be customer first, it could be talent first, it could be people first. Companies that value their talent first, or their people first, they tend to kind of emulate those cultures where it's clear that hiring is a priority, and it's clear that the retention of the great people that are brought in is important. Often that starts with a founder or some leader at the company. And you could hear in their, talking points as they address the company, when they talk about the importance of the people that they employ, of the talent that they employ, of their kind of competitive, position in the respective market. So, from the top down, clearly stating the importance of the people that are employed. Now that then waterfalls down to department leaders and hiring managers. You want leaders to embrace the notion of talent being the priority for their respective organization. So they're setting a high bar for their recruiting counterparts. They're setting clear direction for the talent that is critical for them to be employing. They're leading the charge in the form of engaging that talent, blocking off time on their calendar to recruit these individuals. They're driving referrals themselves. They're incentivizing and promoting for their team to be involved in generating referrals. They're respecting and promoting the need for their team to be involved in interviews, given the importance of that role in the respective interview process. They're celebrating new talent when it's respectively brought into into the door. They're maintaining great relationship with folks who move on, knowing the importance of alumni community and continued referrals and kind of talent brand benefactors on the outside. So those are all tidbits of what a hiring culture looks like. And then when you're a part of a hiring culture, you know that talent is critical to the success of this organization. The talent that works there is highly valued, and there's a critical degree of value placed on the new talent that needs to be brought in. And the companies that say that, they kind of you see them put their money where that mouth is, and that eventually pays complete dividends because you'll see them have strong talent brand as a result. They'll have strong referral flow, and they'll have strong team-wide engagement with respect to the players internally that it takes to consummate a hire. And obviously contrast that with the opposite, right? And then you kind of can start to envision what a very lethargic hiring culture may look like.
Yeah, one of the interesting lessons I learned from Steve Cadigan, he was the first chief HR officer at LinkedIn, and I was lucky enough to have him as a mentor a couple of years back. And I learned a lot from him. But one of the things that he talked about on LinkedIn when he was scaling the company from I think not a handful of folks, or maybe it was a couple hundred, I can't remember when he came in, to around 3,000, was that on every executive meeting, the first thing that they talked about was hiring and talent. It was the top of the priority list. And so I think it's just setting the tone, right? Through certain, through those kind of executive meetings and leadership meetings, it's the prioritization, right? What gets measured is what gets done is kind of, one way to look at it, but it's, how we set the tone for our leadership meetings, and what we cover first and what we're prioritizing will also kind of set the tone for the culture as well. So I always thought that it was just kind of an interesting little factoid that he shared with me.
Yeah, and that's really good insight. And in the last decade, right, all roads led to growth, right? And because the hiring of new people opened up the door to new product build, which opened up the door to new valuations and respective company success. It's not growth at all costs at this point, though. Being able to attract and hire top quality available talent is still critical to the success of an organization. So still a top priority, just less about some number of hires and really more about the criticality and the quality of the respective hires that need to be made to move that organization forward.
Right. And then it's so you start to look at kind of scale, even if it's not hyper growth or anything like that we were seeing and the crazy growth markets of the last decade. But, curious to get your thoughts too. It's as you kind of reach a later growth stage, some of the customers that you mentioned earlier, the late stage category leading, there's a need to become a lot more metrics and data driven. And I feel also a need to really map out the relationship between the company's North Star metrics and hiring plans, and being a little bit more thoughtful about that. And I'm kind of curious to, when it comes to like metrics and data, um, what you prioritize or feel like is most important, or maybe like you could share where companies typically kind of mess it up, or we can approach it however you want, but like just taking a more metrics data driven approach to hiring and how you see companies successfully make that transition to something a little bit more mature and systems
Yeah,
oriented.
yeah, that's a good question. Um, Recruiting is ultimately a data-driven organization. It could be thought about as an analogy to a sales organization or a marketing organization where there's a very clear funnel that any of the respective prospects move through to go from market all the way through to hire. So with regards to recruiting, there's a couple, core data points that are critical to just the basic functioning of an organization. All of that can, find itself into what the market refers to as a capacity model. So a capacity model would commonly include um, something that quantifies number of hires needed to be made over a period of time. That could be net new hires. It could be, hires based on attrition. It could be, anything that equates to a number of hires need to be made, and usually that could be parlayed out over some time period. So that's the demand side of the capacity model. Then you have the supply side, which is basically the mathematical, the what it takes mathematically in order to achieve that demand, based on what recruiting's either historic and or aspired capabilities are. So if you have, let's say 12 openings over a 1 year period, that's your demand. If you have one recruiter who's able to fill jobs at a pace of one hire per month, then you have, your one recruiter filling your 12 job capacity model. Um, Once that recruiter knows that that's what their demand is, what they would then use as metrics is the funnel. And so the funnel would basically start at the top, which is size of market. Let's say the 12 roles or engineering roles. So they would go say the top of funnel would include the total number of engineers that even exist. That's the total. Then that recruiter would go engage that engineering demographic, and there would be some form of a conversion. So from the total market, recruiter engages them, and then some number respond. So that's the top of funnel conversion, and then that conversion goes all the way through the interview process. So from the number of people that the recruiter that responds, the recruiter speaks to and screens, that go through a first interview, they go through an onsite, they go through an offer, that ultimately go through a hire. So that's referred to as a conversion funnel. And so based on those data points, you could mathematically derive how much activity needs to exist at each stage in order to fulfill on whatever demand is needed on the demand side of the capacity model. So that's a very small scale example, but you could just kind of multiply that up. You could insert things like sourcing talent. You could insert things like different channels. You could have conversions for referrals. You could have conversions for applicants. You could have conversions for a whole slew of different service partners. And so that whole kind of complex model is the basically the mathematical driver for any talent leader, or if it's not a talent leader, then organizational leader driving the output of a recruiting organization.
I think that that's like one of the biggest things that a lot of companies miss out on, is just not having enough of an analytical, data driven approach to hiring. I've worked with some pretty late growth stage companies that were overall pretty successful, but from a hiring perspective, really weren't where they need to be when it comes to technology, data reporting. Like there was just a lot left to kind of be desired, and it was kind of a mess, right? Like working within an applicant tracking system that really has no structure, really no best practices built out. And there's just, as a result, a lot of waste that can occur as a result, and potential growth opportunities missed out. You're more likely to, it impacts everything. It could even impact like the employee experience if hiring plans aren't carefully considered.
Right.
People could be overhired. You can get the wrong people hired. It can create cultural issues, the bad Glassdoor reviews, then you have to let folks go if it's really bad, or change out team members, and then that creates more of a hit to culture, and it can take years to rebound off that. So I mean, I've seen those types of things happening, and I think a lot of that can be prevented through just having a more structured approach to hiring,
Right.
both in terms of like the quality of your interview process, but also the entire flow of like when jobs are opened up, to the entire kind of flow of all the way to hiring, like the metrics that, like any important metrics correlated to hiring, it could prevent a lot of very, very expensive mistakes.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, data-driven organizations, data-driven recruiting organizations tend to be, leaps and bounds more successful than non-data-driven organizations. For the most part, just kind of watching how the industry has evolved over the last decade. A lot of what I just shared is, for the most part, considered common knowledge at this point. Most of the larger recruiting organizations have something like this, for the most part, in place. Most growth organizations are still, are in that exact state where they're trying to figure out how to put something like this in place. And then most smaller organizations more fly by the seat of their pants. Though each size organization, if I were advising the earliest stage startup, I would recommend they build this model from day one, just so they themselves, so the founders themselves know how they're doing. Most of them would be and are very surprised to see what the data shows as compared to whatever their anecdotal view of their recruiting success and lack thereof might respectively be.
Oh yeah, for sure. For sure. And like startups are notorious too for just getting, not necessarily always hiring the right folks, or just having some kind of misalignment across leadership teams, or having trouble articulating a clear employee value proposition, or about a million other things, right? So I definitely agree. Like getting started early and building in the right process and technology from the jump is something that'll save a lot of headaches. And the people aspect of the business will not be a roadblock or a bottleneck when you need to start speeding up hiring, right? Like if you wait to implement these things to where you're, 100, 200 employees and you still don't have it ironed out, then it's like when you do need to scale, or if you get to the point where you need to hire significant headcount, then you're going to be slowed down while you figure all this stuff out.
Right.
So it's just one of those
Yeah.
things you have to do. It's the same with your revenue org, your tech stack. You got to try to figure it out earlier on rather than later. Otherwise, it just becomes this huge bottleneck.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The earlier you do it, the more you'll appreciate it being done.
Yeah, for sure. And I think just to kind of shift gears a little bit, get into leadership. You have gone through a lot of experiences over the past few years and a lot of different market conditions, right? Like coming out of like the bull markets that we saw, uh, over the past, like, let's say 10 or 12 years, to operating in a COVID environment, then going through an M&A, selling your business, to going into working at category leading companies such as Robinhood, to running M&A, then talent acquisition. So I'm sure that there's just been a ton of lessons learned, and I'm sure your head has just kind of exploded with a lot of new experiences and insights over the past several years. So I'm kind of curious to get your experience and thoughts on leading teams through kind of like uncharted waters, like it, just from a leadership perspective too. And we can always of course tie it back to people, but leadership is people. So we don't even have to be like too thoughtful of tying it back to like hiring or whatever. Just like generally speaking, like really want to get your thoughts on the experiences that you've had over the past few years, and maybe some of the key takeaways that you've learned about leading teams as of late.
Um, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, thinking back on the years, and I'm still very much in the process of reflecting and doing a lot of journaling and capturing these lessons. I started recruiting in 2002, which was right after the major dot-com crash. So the big kind of headline at that time was, 50% of recruiters just left the business. And I thought that was like the greatest thing ever. So I was like, sweet, less competition, let's go. And I didn't know anything. I was kind of a newbie, trying to figure out what to do with my life. But it turned out that was at the very beginning of this, really nice little growth curve that then crashed in 2008. And then from there, found myself at the very kind of early days of the last decade. And so we wrote that in a really nice way. Um, there were some, reasonable kind of like, curves through that time, but the major, tough time that I'm going back to right now was COVID. And I think every leader and every person has some version of a COVID story. We had just finished our peak year, our most successful year in the history of our company, and then COVID, right? And then it all crashed down. We thought we would completely, we didn't think we would survive, though we did end up surviving, and we did end up rebuilding our culture much faster than we expected. A big element of that was just authenticity, transparency, um, and that was for the purpose of building trust with our team. And then through the building of trust with our team, we were able to together address the problems that we were experiencing, and then together experience the successes and the benefits. Then once the market respectively picked up, we were able to then enjoy the fruits of that labor. Moving on into Robinhood, the first year, the market was still continuing to experience up and to the right elements, and then last year was on the turbulent side, with some really difficult technology industry market conditions. From like a generic leadership perspective, it's critical that a leader knows the mission of the team that they're respectively leading. So clear mission, clear vision. What is it that we together are all aspiring to do? It's critical that the team knows its respective part in fulfilling that mission and vision. So everyone needs clear role and responsibilities. Everyone needs really clear expectations. Everyone needs clear management and support structure. It's critical that there's a common set of values. So like the culture, the decision-making criteria, the thing that bonds us together. We had that. We built an incredibly strong version of that at Binc. If you go talk to any Binc alumni, they'll tell you what it was like working there, and they'll likely tell you very common things and using kind of common terms and common values to describe that. And we were a values and culture-driven organization. And then you ultimately want to be able to measure your results. You want the data, you want the metrics. So you want to be able to like show the team how it's doing, through all of its effort, through the living of the values in service of that mission. And so you want to be able to do that on a very regular, rhythmic basis. And that builds trust, that builds confidence, that builds the motivation to, persevere through whatever tough time you might be, working respectively through. And I found, in enlisting some of those, kind of like foundational elements, the team tends to respond with, like they tend to respond with, well, I guess the absent of what I just shared, the floor is wobbly and moving.
Right.
If you're able to effectively implement what I just shared, the floor starts to sustain, or the team starts to better understand how to respond to the perpetually moving times. And then they tend to respond more confidently in doing their job, and they tend to do their job better, which tends to be, better in service of the mission. So kind of like self-fulfills itself as things progress. I'll just share one of the neat things we did with this at Binc. So we changed our service model a handful of times because we were never loyal to the service model. We were always loyal to market conditions and what would create most value for the customer. At one point, we noticed that the market was just changing so fast, and every company wanted something so different. What we were offering wasn't of value to the market in the same way that it was in previous market conditions. And so we simply just took a look at our service model and adapted it. We created flexibility. We created complete flexibility to the point where we renamed our service model Flex. And then we basically just like embraced the culture of the market that we were a part of. And we said, not only are we good in Flex, like we're built for Flex. were built. And so then our team, instead of like worrying about the changing times or knowing or feeling the need to figure out how to survive, like we thrived in the dynamic times because our service model was built for that. So I believe a good leader can, work can lead their organization in some of the similar kind of analogies or ways that I respectively described.
Yeah, it's hard too. It's like, how do you respond quickly to market conditions without making a false step? Like that could be detrimental in a sense. And that's like walking that fine line. Like I feel like it is very important to, in a sense, be aggressive and fast in decision making, particularly in turbulent times.
Right.
And also to do such a way that is not reckless, I suppose, and sustainable. And like it's from a pricing strategy to a contract strategy, those are things that like I've been giving a lot of time to and thinking about a fair amount and trying to really closely align with feedback that we're getting from customers and from prospective customers. And we are like, it seems like, as you say, kind of constantly sort of tweaking and making sure that uh, people considering us along with existing customers know that we are trying to build a solution specifically around their needs, and that it might look a little bit different. Like we have a basic concept of what we think it'll look like. However, we're curious to get your thoughts too. What are you looking for? And we're shifting the conversation more to like the customers, like, what do you need? What do you want? Before kind of providing like, this is what we do. It's
Right.
like going to the customers and asking like, well, what do you need? What are you looking for? Do you have any ideas in mind? Like, have you kind of given thought to what would be your ideal situation? And then we just, from the very jumps, try to kind of cater the conversation to exactly what it is that they may be looking for. And you
Yeah.
have to be very in tune with that in a turbulent market. It's in a good market, people just they don't seem to be changing too much in terms of what they're looking for. But for whatever reason, in these types of markets, you're right. It's like there's a huge variance. Like people are just looking for different stuff. So it's
Yeah,
interesting.
that's right. Being able, paying attention to your customers, paying attention to the market, being hyper observant is critical during tougher times. So is working twice as hard for half the pay. So is nurturing high value relationships. A lot of valuable things to do during tough times. But I found that through some of the handful of these sorts of experiences, these are kind of like tried and true methods to like sustain, make it through, and then ultimately find yourself stronger on the other side.
Yeah, 100%. There
Yeah.
was one other kind of like just tying back to directly to recruiting. One final topic before we wrap up today. I love your motto. Like one of the things that you told me, you were talking about like how everyone is recruitable, and I love that. Right? I think it's really interesting. Could you share that concept and philosophy with us and how it's applicable to building a talent first culture? Like what exactly? I mean, I guess I know what you mean by it, but like, can we dive into it a little bit more from just like a high level kind of like motto, if you will?
Yeah, yeah. I'll usually say everyone's recruitable um, in one of two situations. One is, if I'm talking to like a founder of a company or a hiring leader, and they already have a preconceived notion of who they want, but that preconceived notion might be limited in some way or not as aspirational as if it really was limitless. And so in that situation, we'll really try to remove any bounds and have them kind of like close their eyes and just kind of like really envision like the best possible person that they can imagine for whatever roles they're trying to fill. Then of course we'll jump into like why that person would be attracted to here, and we'll start to craft a value proposition. The other time when I'll go to something like this is when recruiting is hitting their own version of a ceiling. Like, and recruiting does this to themselves all the time. They'll say, oh, people from this company won't be interested in working here. Or, I'm not going after people at this company anymore because, or oh, I'm not going after that segment of the market because. And really what they're telling me is that their value proposition that they've crafted isn't, at this point in time, compelling enough to attract that caliber of talent. So we'll then, go to the drawing board on the value proposition. We'll say, okay, let's take a look at, who you're going after. let's remove all limits, remove all bounds. Let's take a look at the value proposition you're using. Usually, at that point, we'll find that the pitch or the engagement messaging is super mediocre, and we'll work to improve it to the point where we'll want to get some of this any person sort of talent on a call, and then understand things about their interests, about their ambitions, about why they work where they work, about what good would have to look like in order for them to consider a job change. What good would have to look like at this organization that they're respectively speaking to, and then you get these amazing people that were historically unrecruitable. You get them talking about what it would take for them to join, right? Like and this applies to any single person in the world. If you sit them down in a place where there's a little bit of trust, like a podcast, right? You could extract some incredible, valuable insight about what it would take for them to make a move. And it's different for everyone. Sometimes it might be the specific job. Sometimes it might be the level of the job. Sometimes it might be the compensation. Sometimes it might be the growth trajectory of the company. Sometimes it might be the culture. Sometimes it might be work-life balance. Sometimes it might be something lifestyle related. Sometimes it might be something interest or personal related. We've seen all sorts of different elements of that. And so, through exercises like that, what then happens if you can get like a founding team or like a leadership team, like aspiring for talent in a little bit of an ambitious way. And then you can get the recruiting team kind of like, off of their, little kind of, place of, their own kind of limitations of not thinking they could recruit who they've been going after. Some nice magic happens. And I've heard founders say things like, wow, I cannot believe the quality of talent that we're recruiting here, or like I'm really starting to feel some swagger here with regards to the type of talent that we're going after. And one win leads to a little more courage to go after the second win. And before you know it, like you got leadership and recruiting swinging for some swinging for incredible talent and bringing them in. And that at scale begins to really kind of like completely change the dynamic of an organization.
I agree. I think that it's not just about recruiting. It's like a lot of things in business. I'll notice like people will set goals around what they think is like realistic or achievable, which of course is important. Like our decision making has to be based in reality. However, like one of the things that I try to push my leadership team to do, and there's folks in the organization, is to think like, well, let's not like, okay, we can do okay, maybe that is realistic and maybe that is going to be the goal. But assuming that you had more budget, or you had more resources or infinite resources, like what would be your ideal scenario? What exactly would we do? Right. And working from that place. And then it's like, well, let's figure out if we can make that happen. Even if we might not be able to make it happen today, how can we put in the forecast? How can we make sure we're there in a couple quarters? And let's start there. Let's not start with kind of like the less ideal solution. The less ideal solution might be a Band-Aid, but let's try to make that a Band-Aid, and then work toward creating enough value or whatever to get to the point where we can do the real deal. And I think it's almost in a sense like human nature. Like a lot of times people just won't be coming from the mindset of like, okay, if I had all the resources I need, they're looking at the reality of the environment today, but you almost want people that can look at like the reality of what could become our reality over the next 6 to 12 months. Like when we're building companies, that's what we're doing. We're creating things. And we have to and that comes down to like process and how we execute on a day-to-day basis. It's not just creating the long-term mission. We have to be thoughtful of how that kind of cascades down to individual decision-making, and how we do everything from like positioning an employee value proposition to positioning our solution to customers, our product, right? And it's everything, right?
And I think every company can, connect to some version of being able to point to the successes that they've achieved because of some, high value, maybe intangible, maybe real distinguished quality that some person brought. Like it was like every company could say it was like our designer really did this, or our, engineering leader really did this, or our sales person really did, or whatever it was. But there's usually like specific people that did things that contributed to the company's success. So if you could really kind of imagine the kind of the ideal quality of person, or the ideal person for whatever job it is that's being recruited for, and then you're able to like tune your recruiting machine to be able to go attract and hire that. Again, some really powerful things can happen at aggregate.
I love it. I love it. Well, Boris, this has been a really fun conversation. I always have a good time chatting with you. A lot of good insight here that I know will guide talent strategy. I can see leaders dropping this in Slack channels for their team. So thank you very much for your contribution today. And I really appreciate you joining me on the show.
Awesome. Thanks, James. Yeah, great joining you as well. Thanks for the engaging questions. It was fun to chat it up. And yeah, looking forward to this episode dropping.
Yeah, let's do it. Well, hey, everybody tuning in, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll talk to you real soon. Take care.